All right. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Hallie Grand, and I am going to be facilitating our webinar this evening. So before I pass it over to our presenter, I just want to go over a few reminders. Because this is a webinar, your cameras, microphone, and chat are all disabled during the webinar. If you have any questions at all during the presentation, please use that Q&A feature that's located, it should be on the bottom of your screen in Zoom. We are going to be answering questions at the end of the presentation, but you're going to be able to type your questions in at any point during the webinar, so please feel free to do that. If you'd like to provide comments about the proposed Mariculture site that we're talking about here this evening, you must submit those to our Oyster Mariculture email address, which is oyster.mariculture@tpwd.texas.gov. We're going to be showing that on the screen a little bit later in the presentation today. And you will also be receiving an email tomorrow from Zoom that has some important information, including that email address if you think of something later. You are also going to be receiving a link to our Texas Parks and Wildlife Department education YouTube page, where you'll be able to view a recording of this webinar as well. And that's all I wanted to cover before we get started. So I'm going to hand it over to our presenter for this evening, Zach.
Thanks, y'all. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. 1 second. Okay, can you hear me, see me, Holly? Everything good?
Yep, everything looks good.
Okay, well, thanks y'all for tuning in to another public hearing for a cultivated oyster mariculture grow-out facility, proposed grow-out facility in the Aransas Bay system. For those of you who haven't sat in on one of these yet, let me just give you a quick rundown on what we're going to be doing this evening. Really, we're just going to provide some informational overviews on this proposed facility in Aransas Bay. That includes location of the proposed facility, some of the proposed operations. We'll go over a natural resources survey that was done for the area as well. Then we'll have some time to answer any questions that y'all may have about the proposed facility. And then finally, at the end, we'll give some instructions on how to submit public comment if you choose to do so for this facility. Just to reiterate, we're not taking public comment here tonight at this meeting. We're really just here to give you the information, answer any questions you might have, and then we'll provide you with the email address that you need to submit your public comment to at the end. Before we jump into that, though, we'd like just to give a quick background on oyster mariculture in general, and specifically our oyster mariculture program in Texas. So Texas Parks and Wildlife Department permits the activity of cultivated oyster mariculture grow-out facilities or farms, and also nursery hatchery facilities. So we're going to be talking specifically about a grow-out facility this evening. This is all off-bottom mariculture. So these are not wild oysters. These are not. This is not harvest from the bay bottom. This is a situation in which oysters are stocked into cages or bags. They're grown to a market size, and then they're harvested. So this is not wild oyster harvest. Applications are required to nominate a site after an extensive consultation period with Parks and Wildlife and several other agencies. We then required the applicant to do a natural resources survey to assure that there's no seagrass or oyster reef impacts of this site. Once the permit is awarded, the permit has a 10-year term, and we only allow eastern oyster, or the native oyster species, to be stocked into these facilities, and specifically eastern oyster from Texas broodstock. Just to give you an idea of what those facilities look like or could look like, 3 common gear types that we see. The floating cage system kind of up on the right-hand side of your screen there. That seems to be the most common gear type that we're seeing proposed in Texas, and that's in fact what we'll be talking about for the proposed site tonight. Floating cages. Floating bags is another real similar gear design. And then on the bottom there, the adjustable longline system. That just really didn't seem to be incredibly common on this side of the country. So just some more specifics about the program. So there is an annual fee that's paid based on the size of the grow-out facility or nursery habitat or nursery hatchery site. While TPWD is the lead agency for cultivated oyster mariculture, there are other agencies that hold authorities related to mariculture. And so these agencies include the Texas General Land Office, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the U.S. Coast Guard. And so the applicant will be required to work with each of those agencies to get the necessary authorizations or permits or leases. We do have an active use criteria on our site. So once a site is permitted, we require a certain number of oysters to be stocked per acre per year, just to assure that that area is being used for mariculture. And then because these are not wild oysters, because these are stocked oysters, we do allow year-round harvest. However, all harvest, regardless of when it occurs, must comply with all Texas Department of State Health Services regulations. So let's jump into some specifics about this site. So this proposed site has been assigned the permit number G-0009. That's just a sequential ordering of permits as we receive them, or permit applications as we receive them. This is a grow out facility. So what that means is that the applicant is proposing to stock seed oysters and then grow them out to market size. Like I said, this is located in Aransas Bay. And so you're kind of looking at the map here. We'll show a couple other maps here in a second just to orient you. But for those of you familiar with the area, these green dots here, this is the location of the facility. And this is Mud Island just to the west and north of that facility. This is in Shellfish Harvest Area TX29. That's approved waters. And the total acreage is 2 acres. The map on your left-hand side there kind of shows a kind of more pulled out view to show you exactly where this is located in Aransas Bay. It's kind of in the southern portion of Aransas Bay, like I said, just west and north of Mud Island. And then zoomed in a little bit closer, you can see the extent of the 2-acre facility. Again, just west of Mud Island. That's about, I think it's about 1,300 to 1,400 feet from Mud Island. We do ask that applicants provide a proposed access route to their facility. So this will be accessed by boat, this facility. It's kind of tough to see, but there's a kind of a green line that connects to the proposed site. But the applicant has proposed to primarily access this site from Cove Harbor to the north. Some specifics about the operation. So I'm first going to talk through some of the gear that's going to be used on this site, and then I'll show an overhead view of what that site looks like with that gear arranged. So the applicant has proposed use of this Oyster Grow high flow cage 6-bag system. This has been a fairly common proposal for other farms in the area. A total of 308 cages on the full 2-acre site. These cages are arranged in lines. So there's 22 lines of cages total per site, 14 cages per line, and that's 11 lines of cages per acre. Each line will be anchored with a 66-inch helical anchor. A 3/4 inch 3-strand nylon rope is essentially used as a backbone rope to attach the anchors and the cages. There's lateral, I think 1/2 inch 3-strand nylon lateral nylon rope used to attach the cages to that backbone. Cylinder buoys and 12-inch circular buoys marking the periphery of the site. And then the applicant will also be required to work with U.S. Coast Guard to determine if there's any other navigational aids that are required based on boat traffic in the area. Many applicants also choose to use bird deterrents to keep birds from landing on their cages, and the applicant has indicated they're going to be using large zip ties, essentially creating spikes on the cages to keep birds from landing on them. So now kind of show you the site layout. This is an overhead view of the 2-acre site. So that pink line is the lease perimeter, the 2-acre lease perimeter. The black boxes are the lines of the Oyster Grow cages. You can see, again, 14 cages per line, 11 lines per acre, and then a total of 308 cages on the 2-acre site. Now looking kind of at a cross-sectional view. So the upper portion of this figure is kind of a view from the top of a single line of cages. And then that second image on the bottom is kind of a cross-sectional view of the water column. I really just want to point out to you that these cages are typically oriented floating in the water column. And I'll show you some specifics of what these cage system looks like here in a second. But they're typically floating in the water column. They can be sunk to the bottom, and that's typically done ahead of any major hurricane or tropical activity to protect the gear and protect the product. But they're primarily anchored and floating in the water column. kind of zooming in on what one of these oyster grow cage systems looks like. The measurements on these cages are about 3 foot wide, about 36.5 inches wide, about 5 foot or 60 inches long, and then just under 2 foot high. That is from the bottom of the ballast to the top of the cage, 23.5 inches high. You can see how these are constructed. There's 2 ballasts that are essentially floating a cage system. And then inside of that cage system is where the bags of varying mesh sizes will go in which the oysters are stored. 2 primary orientations of this cage. One is oriented, it's called the drying or desiccating orientation, in which the cages are floated on top of the ballast outside of the water column, allowing those oysters to dry and desiccate and encrusting organisms to fall off. And then the flipped orientation or feeding orientation, where the ballasts are on top, floating that cage in the water column, allowing oysters to feed. Kind of the back and forth between drying and feeding, and then in addition to working oysters, whether that's tumbling or cleaning, is kind of the process of oyster farming or oyster mariculture. And that's kind of goes into our next slide here, just some various on-site operations that the applicant has proposed. They propose to access the site and work the site via boat daily as weather permits. Floating cages, as I said, will be flipped and desiccated as necessary. Gear will be returned to land for any maintenance or cleaning necessary. Their oysters will be tumbled and sorted as needed on the vessel on site. We do require a hurricane plan from all of our applicants. And just in short, this plan has a 3-level approach. And essentially this requires sinking of the cages if needed to help avoid impacts from extreme storms, or adjusting lines for storm surge. Post-storm recovery would include refloating cages, inventory, and reporting any missing gear. So we'll kind of move into the natural resources survey now. As I said, a natural resources survey is required for all sites, even after a fairly intensive desktop review of the area. And the applicant chose to do a side scan survey. So to orient you to this figure, the yellow pins in the center are the 2-acre site. Then there's a 200-foot buffer indicated by these white pins. And then the remainder of the side scan image is a 500-foot buffer. Our requirements state that there can be no seagrass in the site or within a 200-foot buffer, and then no oyster habitat or oyster reef in the site or within a 500-foot buffer of the site. We also require, so within the 200-foot buffer and in the site, we require what we call ground truthing or sediment core samples to check for below ground seagrass biomass that might not be picked up on the side scan image. And each one of these white or yellow marks indicates a location where those samples were collected. We also require additional ground truthing or sediment core samples anywhere a bottom feature is picked up by the side scan sonar image. And that's kind of what you see here, these green outlines on the side scan sonar image. These are areas where we observed some sort of feature on the side scan sonar image. It can be difficult to distinguish seagrass or oyster reef in that image. So the applicant went out and collected additional ground truthing samples there and determined that those were, in fact, seagrass in those areas. Though just to be clear, that's outside of the required 200-foot buffer. And so the site then meets all of our siting requirements. So just to reiterate, that side scan sonar survey was conducted June and July of 2022. Those sediment samples were collected September, October of 2022. The depth range on the site is anywhere from 4 to 8 feet. To give you an idea of what the sediment cores look like, a vast majority of them were kind of what you see on the right-hand side there, just kind of sandy or mud. But those seagrass surveys or seagrass samples in the 500-foot buffer kind of look like that. Again, that's outside of the required 200-foot buffer. So that site meets all of our requirements for seagrass and oyster reef buffers. Okay, and then just to finish up, if anybody wants to give or chooses to give public comment about this site, the deadline for public comment is March 8th, 2023, and you'll submit that public comment to oyster.mariculture@tpwd.texas.gov. I'll put that email address up on the screen here in a second, just so you have that. Once we get through this public comment period, we will, with the applicant, assess and address any comments that we get. Assuming we're good to go forward after that phase, the applicant will be issued a conditional permit, but no mariculture activity can begin with the conditional permit. All that does is it then allows the applicant to go to some of those other agencies and get the necessary authorizations, permits, leases from them. Once they've secured all those authorizations, they'll bring all of that back to Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. We'll determine that they're in the appropriate form, and then at that point, the final permit will be issued, after which mariculture activity can begin. So again, if you choose to submit public comment, please do so at the email address on the screen. And in general, if you have any questions about oyster mariculture, we have a great website on TPW's main website. You can search Cultivated Oyster Mariculture, pull up the Mariculture website. You can go there to find any future meetings that we have regarding upcoming sites. There's a site viewer where you can view existing and conditional and pending sites in their locations, and any other general information about the program. And that said, I am going to open it up for any questions that anybody has about this site. Again, I just want to reiterate, if you're wanting to give public comment about the site, please do so at that email address. But if you have any specific questions about this site, you can enter those in the Q&A window associated with your Zoom platform. All right. We'll give it a couple minutes to see if anybody has any questions. Okay, looks like no questions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Holly to finish us up tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. So again, just a reminder that you all will be receiving an email tomorrow from Zoom with a link to this, to the channel where you can find a recording of this video, as well as that Oyster Mariculture email address if you think of something in between the end of this webinar and at some point in the future. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you, Zach, and thank you, Lindsay, for being on the call as well. And we will see you all next time. Thank you, everyone.